Hello people, today I wanted to talk about a fun adventure title called Tunic, reminiscent of classic franchises like Zelda, although I think there's more than meets the eye in this game, and honestly I think it's a little slept on. It does have a pretty good following, but I feel it should be talked about more because this is one of the better adventure games I've played in a long while. It could just be the timing and maybe it just hit the right spot at the right time, but there's quite a few things I like about it, although I do think it can overstay its welcome a bit. So without further ado, let's just get into the review. Tunic does a good job of just throwing you in the adventure. There's no story intro to try to give you some background lore to invest you in the world. Instead, the game wants you to be invested through actual gameplay. You just wake up and start venturing. There's no background goal like saving the world or saving a princess. Even though it can lead to that premise, the main thing that's leading you is your own curiosity, your thirst for adventure, the need to explore. And I'd say this game's exploration and discovery is pretty well done. It flows well, it feels organic, and the pacing is pretty good too. There wasn't many moments where I felt like I was in an area for too long and I started getting bored. Instead, I would make new discoveries which would lead into something new to experience. And typically when it comes to exploration, you're finding hidden paths, shortcuts, and new items to use on your adventure. And the thing is that keen eyes are rewarded, although they're vital for the experience. It's important to take the time to look around locations to see if there's any crevices or corners that you can actually get behind, because it can lead you to a different path that can maybe find an item that doesn't just make you stronger but can make you progress through the world. And the manner of how you progress and find your way through the world is pretty interesting. So pretty much you find these pages that are actually a game manual, but the thing about this game manual is that it's typically written in a fictional language, so you have to look at things like buttons and imagery to piece together what things do, what to find, and maybe where to go. And I find this is a really fun way to teach the player because it's kind of like a form of puzzle solving and it's pretty unique. And something I find interesting is that the game will teach you mechanics that were already in your repertoire. So what happens is that you'll return to areas with this newfound knowledge, thinking to yourself like, oh my god, I could have done this the entire time, leading you to a new discovery and area to maybe explore. And this can also open up different possibilities on another playthrough. Instead of having to explore and make the same discoveries, you can sort of speedrun it because you have this knowledge in your head now. I find it's a pretty interesting form of progression. And speaking of that, I want to talk about combat and progression. So the game is tagged as a Souls-like, and to be honest, it's a pretty good way to describe the game. It has the same design philosophies. There's an importance to knowing when and when not to attack, when and where to dodge, managing your stamina, and so on. And the thing is that I have a lot of history with Souls-like games. I've enjoyed and played multiple playthroughs of games like Elden Ring, the Dark Souls series, as well as doing damageless runs for bosses and Sekiro, so I'm somebody that does like a good challenge. And honestly, Tunic could kick your ass if you're not careful or observant, although it still is very manageable. It's just that in the beginning, the game can be a little rough. The only means you have to defend yourself is a fucking stick, and it sure as hell feels like one because you're pretty much pussy tapping enemies, barely denting their health and poise, so finding a window to attack can actually be pretty small, so you have to play really defensively because if you get hit, you can get chunked pretty hard. But the game does a good job of actually making you feel like you're moving forward and getting stronger. You have the very common power-ups where you can get more health and stamina, but you can also get these cards that can give you passive abilities, although getting main items like a sword is a night and day difference from the stick, because now you can actually deal damage, but you can also stagger enemies, which can change the pacing of combat tremendously depending on the enemy type. And that's the thing, depending on the enemy or the items you use, your strategies and approach to combat can change. Sometimes it's better to block, sometimes it's better to circle enemies, or sometimes it's better to be right in their face and be hyper aggressive. And sometimes you might feel overwhelmed, so you're gonna chuck a bomb at a group of enemies. It all really depends. But I really found myself making use of sub-items and magic, and especially during boss fights. Now, there's not many bosses in Tunic, but I do still like their designs, although in comparison to Zelda, I find they're not as distinct. But I do find myself more engaged by them because I like Souls-like combat and being challenged. And the thing is that they do a good job of that, and they have some pretty varied movesets. Now, something I noticed is that the invincibility frames on your dodge are actually a little smaller, so timing is a little tighter, so you have to be more observant of when the attack is coming down. It may feel strange at first, but it feels satisfying when you start fighting efficiently. Now, the only problems I have with boss fights have to do with the game's controls, collision, and some hitboxes. So, for example, locking onto the enemy, you have to hold on to the left trigger, and this doesn't matter so much in the open world because you're not going to be using it that often. But in a boss fight that you're probably going to constantly retry, you're going to be holding onto that button for a while, and honestly, I felt my finger breaking and I was getting like early stage arthritis or some shit. I couldn't find an option to make the lock on a toggle, and I think it would have been helpful, at least for me. For all I know, maybe my hands are just fucked up after all these years, so maybe not a huge deal for other people. But I gotta say, I don't like parrying in this game. Now don't get me wrong, it's useful, it's just I don't like the control scheme for it where you have to double tap the right trigger in order for it to work. The problem with this is that it can be a little finicky at times, so instead of parrying, sometimes you'll just block twice and look like a fucking idiot. But when it works, it does feel very satisfying. Something that could be problematic though is collision. Sometimes you could get stuck on objects or ledges, and the thing is that there's a ledge guard so you don't fall off of things, which is good. Although sometimes it can work against you because instead of being able to dodge in a direction, you get stuck on like an invisible wall. But I'd say the biggest issue is becoming a stick of Old Spice and getting stuck under the armpits of these large fucking bosses. But for the most part, I was able to avoid that. Although I will say that the hitbox and tracking on some attacks can be pretty fucking insane in this game. But overall, I wasn't driven too crazy by these things. And the bosses do remind me of Souls games where you're gonna keep trying at them, you might get frustrated, but the more you play against them, you learn more and more about them, you become more efficient, and then once you beat them, you feel accomplished. So I like them overall. Now, something I wanted to get into was padding. Remember at the beginning of this video, I said something along the lines of this game overstaying its welcome a bit? I started feeling that way in the end game, and the thing is that Tunic is not a long game. I finished it in about like 10 or 11 hours, and while I can enjoy games that are hundreds of hours, I'm somebody that actually prefers short and sweet experiences. To me, it's the quality of the content, not the amount of it. And Tunic does have good qualities, it's just that I think they waver a bit in this portion of the game. So pretty much when you get 3 key items in the adventure, you end up fighting the final boss, you get your ass handed to you, and then you wake up in the spirit world, which is sort of the equivalent of the dark world in A Link to the Past. So I'm thinking to myself like, oh, there's even more dungeons? Christ. But something I noticed is that, oh, I'm back at my base stats, so I'm gonna be pretty weak and these enemies are gonna be pretty strong now. So I assumed I was pretty much gonna get an ability to help me traverse this new world, as well as getting my stats back from dungeons. Well, I was sort of right. Now, you go through a main dungeon, you get an ability where you can dash around and go between ledges, and I was like, okay, cool. But what the game expects you to do is retread the same areas from like the lighter world, except they're just a bit more depressing, and all you're doing is going to these graves and collecting back your stats. Now, it didn't take me too long because I already made a mental note of these things because I had a feeling these graves would be significant. But I just don't find it engaging to retread more fucked up versions of the same locations where you may fight a couple of enemies just to get the stats that I already owned. It's like the game's trying to make you feel like you're getting ready for the final boss and you're progressing, but I'm literally progressing back to the same point I already was. Personally, I would have left retreading these same areas for puzzles meant for the Golden Path ending, which I'll get into in a bit, but I would have left getting your stats back in that main dungeon in the spirit world where you fight these like waves of enemies and maybe every time you beat a wave, you get one of your stats back. And because of this, you can have players strategize which order to do them. Maybe they'll do one where they'll get their stamina back, but then they've started getting damaged, so they'll do the one where they get their health stats back. Then when you finish all the waves, you get the ability to traverse more of the world. Now, I'm not saying that this is the greatest idea in the world, but I'm just saying I find this less tedious and more engaging than just retreading the same areas to get back to the point I already was at. So like I said before, I would have left retreading these areas for puzzles meant for the Golden Path ending. And speaking of the Golden Path ending, this shit is fucking insane. If you want to talk about cryptic, Tunic is one of the definitions. The game manual that I was talking about before seems to be a lot deeper than we realize, and the thing is that if you're somebody that's interested in things like symbolism, codes, and heavy visualization, and maybe having to use paper, you're probably gonna really enjoy getting this ending. But personally, I didn't have the patience to complete this, but that's not me saying that this is terrible, because I respect the hell out of this artistically. It takes a lot of time and effort to create puzzles like this and input the clues for players to find. And the thing is that I really respect the developers for having so much faith in the players to figure this out for themselves. And there are people that figured it out and they must have felt really good when they did. I know I felt really satisfied when the gears started spinning in my head and then it finally clicked and I was like, holy fucking shit, this is insane. It felt pretty damn good figuring it out. It's just that at some point some of these puzzles were pretty much giving me brain damage, and I gotta say it was pretty tedious once again retreading the same areas just to find these puzzles. You could make traveling a little less painful though, because there's accessibility options where you can turn off things like stamina management, so you can start moving around the map without thinking about recuperating. But honestly, I was getting a little tired, but I got the gist of it, and I gotta say that this is really impressive, and I do really respect it. So to conclude, if you're looking for an enjoyable adventure with fun exploration, progression, some challenging combat, and bosses, I would recommend Tunic, although I'd probably recommend going for the regular ending if you want a fresh but more straightforward adventure. Although, if you're somebody that really likes cryptic puzzles like symbolism and codes and heavy visualization, I would definitely recommend trying to go for the golden path ending because you'll probably feel really good once it starts clicking in your head. Although you might lose a bit of patience having to retread some of the same areas, as well as dealing with some possible issues with controls, hitboxes, and collision. But overall, I very much enjoyed my time with Tunic. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Peace.